Hi everyone. Our old buddy Casey the Catholic is at it again. You remember the guy who likes to dress in brown? This guy?
For Catholics, this does not mean that God is the result of some wishful thinking or illogical fallacies.
I suspect that clip will come in handy. Let's see what amazing, brand new evidence you can bring to the table.
In the absence of verifiable scientific evidence for God.
Well then, what's the point of this video? The question, does God exist, is a question about the actual state of observable reality. You know, the physical reality, whatever you want to call it, the reality around us, external reality. And questions about that are answered by looking at the empirical evidence. You have a model that makes a prediction and you look for evidence supporting that prediction that could potentially have falsified it. In other words, you use science. So if you have no scientific evidence, if you admit straight up you have no scientific evidence, then guess what? You have no evidence.
Theologians and philosophers have turned to logical arguments to prove God's existence for centuries.
Arguments are not evidence. The argument, what you'd call the proof for the existence of gravitational waves, was presented by Albert Einstein in 1916. In science, we don't call the presentation of an argument, no matter how convincing it may seem, proof. We call it a hypothesis. Gravitational waves were detected indirectly in 1974 and directly measured in 2015. These observations were the evidence supporting the hypothesis. Einstein's argument for why they should exist was a very convincing one, but it was still just a hypothesis. Gravitational waves exist according to a model, in this case a rather complicated mathematical one. It was the empirical evidence that showed us that the model is, at least in this context, a good enough representation of reality. I'm not interested in whether God exists according to a model, like an old story or a bunch of arguments. Any hypothesis, no matter how convincing, is just a hypothesis until the empirical evidence is there.
It's only a model.
But are your arguments even convincing? I mean, I've heard lots of them and I have never come across one that even comes close to being convincing. But go ahead, let's see what you've got. Let's see your brand new arguments that I've never heard before.
Each of these arguments can be grouped into one of four categories of approaches: cosmological, ontological, moral, and theological.
Really? Really? Same old shit. Well, I haven't done this in a while, so okay, go ahead.
The first type, the cosmological argument, is probably the most famous and the strongest of the arguments. What this argument proposes is that if there is anything that is now that wasn't before, there must be something that caused it.
Cause needs to be properly defined before I can actually grant this, but if you define cause in such a way that even the fundamental behavior of nature itself qualifies as a cause, meaning that apparently uncaused quantum events, for example, have causes, then okay.
We know that if something, A, exists, it did not create itself, but was created by something else, B. To repeat this process infinitely would not make any sense.
So, what's the problem with that? Reality is under no obligation to make sense. Lots of things don't make sense, but are still true. For example, hello quantum mechanics. Hello general relativity. Hell, most people have a hard time making sense of the fact that an object twice as heavy won't fall twice as fast. Reality is under no obligation to make sense. There is nothing self-contradictory about an infinite regress. So I don't see how you can rule it out just by saying it doesn't make sense. It seems like you're saying that if it doesn't make sense to you, it can't be true, and that's an argument from incredulity.
For Catholics, this does not mean that God is the result of some wishful thinking or illogical fallacies.
I was right, it did come in handy.
For there must be a first cause, and the only way for this to be true is if there is a being that is causality itself.
That's grammatically nonsensical. The nouns being and causality are in two completely different categories that don't overlap. Being is concrete, causality is abstract. It's like you're talking about a banana which is long division. It's grammatically nonsensical. It doesn't mean anything. But even if we disregard that, you're wrong about a being being the only possible first cause. Since time is part of nature, there has never been a point in time at which nature did not exist. Ergo, nature never began to exist, and its fundamental behavior can cause things to begin to exist. These things, given the right circumstances, can gradually form more and more complex structures. If there was a first cause, and I see no way to conclude that there actually was, that first cause would most likely have been the fundamental behavior of nature itself. You haven't shown that a being, much less your God specifically, is the only possible cause. You haven't even shown that it is a possible cause. See, in order for something to be a possible cause of something, first it has to actually exist. So you're doing this backwards. You need to prove that God exists first before you can attribute to him the creation of the universe. This argument is circular because you're trying to reach the conclusion that God exists by assuming that God has done something which presupposes that he exists, which is the conclusion of the argument. You're begging the question.
Illogical fallacies.
Can we move on now?
For Anselm, it is a logical fact that if there is a God, he must be greater than anything else that can be conceived. If we could conceive of something greater, then that would be God's, not the first thing. Since we're able to state this, we know that God exists, at the very least, in our minds. But if God only exists in our minds, then the idea existing in reality would be greater than our conception of God, but there can be nothing greater than God. Therefore, God must exist in reality.
Stop. Ontological arguments are just word games. You cannot define something into existence. The whole point of these is to say, in some more or less convoluted way, that God exists by definition, and it doesn't work that way. I can define my suitcase as containing $50 million in cash. That doesn't mean that the money will magically materialize inside it. Definitions are just arbitrary declarations of what I want a word to refer to. They have no effect on reality. Also, I have to point out that I can imagine a being far greater than your God. For example, a universe-creating deity that doesn't do such a piss-poor job that if one of his creations eats a fruit, the whole universe falls apart. Or one that is capable of forgiving people who were acting according to his plan anyway, without requiring that they believe that a Jewish carpenter got nailed to a board. Or, look, I could go on for a long time. Read the Bible and you'll see how not great your God is. It's trivial to imagine a being greater. So if this argument actually worked, which it doesn't, it would actually disprove Christianity, since according to Christianity, there's only one God. This might be an argument you should stay away from. It actually hurts your case.
For some, this might sound like a mind trick or some wishful thinking. Surely thinking about unicorns doesn't make them exist. But that's not what Anselm is getting at. What this argument does is less convert atheists into theists, and more ground our understanding of God logically.
Well, then why bring it up as proof? Do you even know what it is you're trying to do? Do you know what a proof is?
When we look to human nature across time and space, there is quite a bit of diversity, yes, but strikingly, there is a lot of similarity as well. In every culture, cold-blooded killing is immoral.
Okay, what else would a member of the Catholic clergy think is wrong?
In every people, rape is an abomination. The The fact that these truths are held universally.
When we look at the behavior of the Catholic Church, the organization you work for, we see very clearly that they are not.
And if that's the case, if there are moral truths that exist in nature universally, meaning that they were not written or prescribed by humans, then there must be an intelligent, moral being that fashioned the way the world is.
No, Casey, there are things most people, but evidently not all, agree on. These are things that objectively benefit society, contributing toward the creation of a society in which we actually want to live. For example, we value our lives and our property, so we don't want to live in a society full of murderers and thieves. Refraining from killing and stealing contributes toward creating such a society. But some people figure it's okay to break the law as long as they can get away with it. That would not be the case if we were all born with knowledge of absolute morality.
There are some individuals in our world that disagree with these precepts, and even more that blatantly ignore them. This does not disprove the existence of natural law, but merely points to the disobedience and ignorance of some in humanity.
No, you seem to think that the figurative angels on our shoulders telling us what's right are all saying the same thing. I'm just choosing to listen to the devil on the other shoulder instead. That's not it. They're not saying the same thing. Actions have objective consequences, but which consequences are desirable is a matter of opinion. This means that objective morality simply cannot exist, and even if God existed and dictated a bunch of rules, that wouldn't change anything, because they would be his rules, his standard, his opinion, his morality. In other words, it would be subjective. Next.
When you think about the complexity of our world, the nature of subatomic particles, the depth of the human brain, how delicate life is in this universe and yet it thrives, and then consider the astronomical number of factors that had to be in place for each to develop over a course of 14 billion years, it seems improbable, to say the least, that they happened by accident. You're telling me that we exist simply by chance?
No.
Illogical fallacies. The universe is more than a random collection of atoms. It has order, intelligibility, beauty, and even purpose.
I was with you until purpose. The word you're really looking for is function. That something performs a function in some context does not imply that it has a purpose.
There is no way that all of this is the result of mere randomness.
It's not, and no one says it is. Nature behaves in a deterministic manner. Even at the quantum scale, where things seem very random, nature is still governed by deterministic laws that can be used to calculate probabilities.
Christians conclude that there must be a source of the intelligence.
What intelligence? You assume there's an intelligence behind everything, so you can reach the conclusion that there's an intelligence behind everything. Yet another circular argument.
Illogical fallacies. When we look to the natural world and see even inanimate, unintelligent things acting with some intelligible pattern or towards a particular end,
the goal everything is working toward is higher entropy, a more even energy distribution. This is not because of intentional design, but because of simple statistics. States with an even energy distribution are more common, much more common, than states with an uneven energy distribution. There's no design involved here, you're just scientifically ignorant, and where your ignorance can't give you a good answer, you insert God. It's the good old God of the gaps argument. An argument from ignorance fallacy.
Illogical fallacies.
Your arguments are terrible, and you clearly know this because...
Even the most rational of arguments will not convert some people who have not received the gift of faith.
There you go. These so-called proofs only work if you already have faith, if you already accept the conclusion for irrational reasons. That's not how proofs work. The only statement that must be accepted on faith because it can't be accepted otherwise is a false one. These arguments are not meant to convince, but to reassure the gullible sheep in the pews. It's not about truth, it's about control. It may have started out as a failed but honest search for truth in the Middle East thousands of years ago, But once people with too much power got involved, it became all about controlling people. And I strongly suspect that's what you're trying to do here. Help your criminal organization stay relevant in a world that is starting to grow out of its infancy, in which whatever good religion may have done while we were turning tribes into nations is far outweighed by the harm it causes by promoting ignorance and hate, which you call love. If I'm wrong, present actual evidence. Present your falsifiable prediction and the empirical verification of it. I'll be here waiting, and you may not believe this, but I will have an honest, open mind. But I won't have faith. And I definitely won't be holding my breath. See ya.